The guilds that kept time, craft, routine, and the slow pulse of medieval cities. The rise of the guilds. When you think of medieval cities, you might imagine narrow streets, market squares, tall spires, and the constant hum of trade. Beneath that hum, however, lay an intricate web of organizations that gave shape to daily life. The guilds. These associations of craftsmen and merchants governed much of urban existence. They regulated prices, controlled quality, organized training, and even arranged religious ceremonies. Guilds were not glamorous. Their records are filled with dull entries about apprenticeship contracts, fines for improper waits, and payments for candles in guild chapels. Yet these seemingly boring details reveal how medieval people structured time, work, and community. Without guilds, medieval cities would have been chaotic. With them, they pulsed to the slow rhythm of craft and regulation. What was a guild? At its simplest, a guild was a collective of people engaged in the same trade. Blacksmiths formed one guild, weavers another, bakers another. Merchants, too, often banded together to regulate long-distance trade. The earliest medieval guilds began as fraternities, sworn associations of men who pledged mutual aid, both in business and in life. Over time, they became formalized institutions with charters, privileges, and obligations. Guilds existed to protect their members. They limited competition by fixing prices, restricted entry by controlling apprenticeships, and defended their rights in courts and councils. For a craftsman, membership was both a protection and a requirement. To work outside the guild was often illegal, or at least severely frowned upon. The rhythm of apprenticeship. Perhaps the most important function of guilds was training. Boys, sometimes as young as 12, were bound by contract to a master. These apprentices lived in the master's household, ate at his table, and worked under his supervision for years. The contracts are dry but revealing. Stipulations about how long the apprenticeship would last, how much food and clothing the master was obliged to provide, and what punishments awaited disobedience. After several years, the apprentice became a journeyman, free to work for wages, but not yet a full guild member. Only after producing a masterpiece and paying a fee could he enter the guild as a master in his own right. The progression was slow, often taking a decade or more. But through this process, guilds ensured continuity of craft, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Regulation of work. Guilds regulated nearly every aspect of their trades. Bakers' guilds inspected ovens and weighed loaves to prevent fraud. Weavers' guilds checked cloth for quality and imposed fines on those who cut corners. Blacksmiths were required to use approved measures of iron and to maintain tools according to standard. These rules were not exciting, but they shaped the daily rhythm of work. Each morning, inspectors might walk through workshops, checking scales, measuring loaves, or testing cloth. Records of fines are repetitive. So-and-so fined for light bread, another fined for poor weaving. Yet behind the repetition lay a system that kept urban life orderly. Religion and community. Guilds were not only economic, but also social and religious institutions. Each had a patron saint, a chapel, and obligations to support members in times of need. Guilds paid for candles to burn in chapels, organized processions on feast days, and arranged funerals for members. The religious side of guilds tied them deeply into community life. A craftsman was not just a worker, but also a brother in a fraternity, bound by oaths and rituals. Even the most mundane aspects of work, baking bread, weaving cloth, forging iron, were sanctified by association with a saint and by the guild's rituals of prayer. Tensions and conflicts. Of course, guilds were not universally loved. For outsiders, they could seem restrictive and monopolistic. Those excluded from membership, women, immigrants, or unlicensed workers, often resented guild control. Town councils sometimes clashed with guilds over authority, as did rulers who sought to tax or regulate them. Yet guilds endured because they balanced interests. They gave craftsmen security, ensured standards for customers, and provided cities with stable structures of organization. Their records, though monotonous, testify to centuries of negotiation between freedom and control. The pulse of cities. Through guilds, medieval cities developed a rhythm. Work began and ended at set hours. Markets operated under regulated prices. Apprentices advanced through prescribed stages, and feast days marked time with processions and prayers. Guild bells rang to signal meetings, while guild ledgers tracked obligations with relentless precision. The hum of the city was thus structured not only by the clang of hammers and the shuffle of feet, but also by the slow, steady keeping of records. Guilds, in their repetitive, bureaucratic way, kept time for medieval life. Reflection. When you picture a medieval guild, do not imagine drama or spectacle. Instead, think of a long ledger filled with names and numbers, of apprentices bent over workbenches, of inspectors weighing loaves or measuring cloth. Think of processions winding through narrow streets, candles flickering in chapels, and bells tolling at regular hours. The guilds were the heartbeat of the city, not fast, but steady, repetitive, and enduring. And yet, one might wonder, if guilds kept time for centuries, what happened when that rhythm faltered? When economic change, new technologies, or shifting powers challenged their slow order? Inside the guilds, apprenticeship, disputes, and the monotony of regulation. If the guild as an institution gave medieval cities their rhythm, the lived experience of guild life was shaped by routine and detail. It was not only about lofty charters or festive processions, but about small contracts, daily inspections, and household discipline. The guild was not simply a professional association. It was a way of living that bound individuals to rules, obligations, and endless records. Apprenticeship as a household. An apprentice was not just a worker in training. He was part of his master's household. The contracts that survive tell us this plainly. They stipulate not only how many years the boy would serve, but also what food, clothing, and lodging the master must provide. A typical clause might require that the master feed the apprentice bread and ale, meat when it is eaten, and a pair of shoes each year. In return, the apprentice owed obedience, labor, and loyalty. The arrangement blurred the line between family and workplace. Apprentices lived under the master's roof, ate at his table, and slept in his house. Discipline was strict. Records show masters fined for beating apprentices too harshly, while apprentices could be punished for running away, wasting materials, or idling during work hours. The monotony of apprenticeship was training itself, sweeping workshops, tending fires, carrying water, and gradually learning the craft through repetition. Only after years of this routine could an apprentice hope to rise to journeyman status. The life of a journeyman. Journeymen occupied an in-between space, free to earn wages, but not yet full members. Many traveled from city to city, seeking work in different workshops. Their records often appear in wage lists, where they are simply named and paid for weeks of labor. Journeymen also appear in guild disputes. Some complained of masters exploiting them, while others were fined for working outside the guild or for failing to attend guild meetings. The slow process of becoming a master, producing a masterpiece, paying fees, and gaining approval, kept many in this liminal stage for years, sometimes for life. Disputes and discipline. Guilds kept order through rules and fines. The records of guild courts or assemblies are filled with repetitive entries. So-and-so fined for using false measures. Another fined for selling outside the market. A journeyman punished for insulting a master. The disputes were often mundane. A weaver might be accused of stretching cloth to make it appear longer. A baker might be charged with selling loaves lighter than the approved weight. A blacksmith might be caught mixing inferior metals into tools. Each case required investigation, testimony, and judgment. Though monotonous, these records reveal the guild's determination to maintain standards. By policing their members, guilds protected both their reputation and their monopoly. Yet they also reveal constant friction between masters and journeymen, between guilds and outsiders, between ideals of craft and the realities of business. The role of women. Women were not usually guild members, but they were not absent. Widows of masters sometimes continued workshops in their late husbands' names. Daughters of masters might marry apprentices, binding families into craft networks. In certain trades, such as brewing, midwifery, and textiles, women played more active roles, though often at the margins of guild authority. Records show women fined for selling ale without permission or praised for maintaining quality in textile production. Their presence reminds us that guild life was not solely male, even if guild charters and rituals emphasized brotherhood. Inspections and the boredom of regulation. One of the most tedious yet essential aspects of guild life was inspection. Officials walked through markets and workshops, checking loaves, measuring cloth, weighing goods. They carried standard measures and scales, comparing merchants' wares against official models. Records of inspections are mind-numbing in their repetition. A single page might list dozens of fines for underweight bread, poor cloth, or false measures. Yet these dull entries were the machinery of trust in medieval markets. Customers relied on guild inspectors to ensure fairness, and the city relied on the guild to keep commerce honest. The monotony of inspections mirrored the monotony of craft itself, daily routines that ensured stability, if not excitement. Festivals and rituals. Amid this bureaucracy, guilds also punctuated time with rituals. Each had its feast day, often tied to the patron saint of the trade. On that day, members processed through the streets, carrying banners, lighting candles, and attending Mass together. These occasions broke the routine but also reinforced it. The same prayers were said each year, the same candles burned, the same accounts rendered for expenses. Even celebration was orderly, woven into the guild's cycle of obligation. Records as memory. The most striking thing about guilds is how much paper and parchment they produced. Charters laid down rules. Apprenticeship contracts bound boys to masters. Ledgers recorded fines, tolls, and festival expenses. Minute books noted decisions of guild assemblies. These records, dull as they seem, are the reason we can reconstruct the life of medieval cities. They tell us what was valued: honest measures, steady training, obedience to rules. They remind us that stability, not innovation, was the goal. Reflection. If you imagine a medieval guild hall, do not think of grand debates or sudden decisions. Picture instead clerks writing in ledgers, apprentices sweeping floors, inspectors weighing loaves, and journeymen waiting for wages. Think of fines imposed quietly, of prayers said in chapels, of candles flickering during processions. The guilds lived not in drama, but in routine. They kept time for the city, slow, repetitive, sometimes stifling, but steady. And yet, one wonders, if guilds were so dedicated to routine and regulation, how did they cope when new forces, trade expansion, new technologies, and rising states began to disrupt their careful order? Decline, transformation, and the legacy of guilds. Guilds shaped the rhythm of medieval cities for centuries, but like all institutions, they were not eternal. By the late Middle Ages and early modern period, their influence began to wane. Markets grew larger, trade expanded beyond local boundaries, and rulers asserted greater authority over economic life. What had once seemed the steady pulse of urban order began to falter, giving way to new rhythms of commerce. Expansion of trade. One of the first challenges to guilds was the expansion of trade networks. In the early Middle Ages, most production and exchange were local. A town's bakers fed its citizens, its weavers clothed them, its blacksmiths forged their tools. Guilds thrived in such an environment, regulating small, self-contained economies. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, long-distance trade expanded dramatically. Italian merchants shipped spices from the east, Flemish cloth flooded markets, and Hanseatic traders dominated the North and Baltic seas. Goods could now come from hundreds or even thousands of miles away, beyond the control of local guilds. Records show complaints from guilds about foreign cloth of inferior quality or spices sold without regulation. Guild rules, once sufficient for small markets, struggled to cope with the vast scale of international commerce. Pressure from monarchs and states. Guilds also faced pressure from above. As monarchies grew stronger, kings and princes sought more direct control over taxation and economic life. Guild privileges, once granted by charters, increasingly came under scrutiny. Rulers levied taxes on guilds, intervened in disputes, and sometimes curtailed their powers. In France and England, royal officials gradually took over many of the functions guilds had once held, such as regulating weights and measures. What had been a communal responsibility now became part of the central state's bureaucratic machinery. Guild records from this period reveal a steady stream of petitions to monarchs, begging for the renewal of privileges or protesting interference. The monotonous language of these documents, phrases repeated across decades, reflects both persistence and desperation. Technology and change. Technological change also eroded guild control. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, created a new craft that did not fit neatly into old systems. Gunpowder weaponry, new ship designs, and improved textile machinery altered production in ways guild rules struggled to accommodate. Some guilds attempted to regulate new technologies, imposing rules on presses or workshops. Others tried to adapt, incorporating new crafts, but often their regulations seemed outdated, stifling innovation rather than fostering it. Critics accused guilds of conservatism, of clinging to routine in a world that was moving faster. The rise of capitalist structures. Perhaps the most profound change came with the rise of capitalist structures of production. Merchants with capital began organizing work outside the guild framework. Instead of journeymen aspiring to become masters, many became wage laborers in workshops controlled by wealthy entrepreneurs. This system, sometimes called the putting out system, allowed merchants to bypass guild restrictions. They provided raw materials to workers in their homes, collected finished goods, and sold them in larger markets. The guild's careful regulation of quality and apprenticeship was undermined by the sheer scale of this new production. Records show guilds fining members for participating in such systems, but enforcement proved difficult. Over time, the rigid ladder of apprentice-journeyman master gave way to more flexible, but less secure, wage labor. Resistance and survival. Guilds did not disappear overnight. In many towns, they remained influential well into the 16th and 17th centuries. They adapted where they could, negotiating new privileges, organizing charitable work, or aligning themselves with civic governments. Some guilds became more ceremonial than practical, focusing on processions, feasts, and religious functions. Others turned into friendly societies, providing aid to members but exerting little economic control. In certain cities, guilds even revived briefly during periods of crisis, offering familiar structures in uncertain times. The records of these later guilds show both continuity and change. The same formulas, the same prayers, the same fines, but alongside them, new appeals to civic councils, new disputes over trades unimagined in earlier centuries. The legacy of guilds. Though guilds as economic powers declined, their legacy endured. They left behind a wealth of records, apprenticeship contracts, minute books, charters, and accounts. These documents, often repetitive and dry, allow historians to reconstruct the rhythms of work and life in medieval cities with extraordinary detail. Guilds also left a cultural imprint. They shaped the structure of urban society, provided models for later trade unions, and embedded the idea that work should be organized collectively, not just individually. Their religious and charitable traditions influenced civic institutions long after their economic power waned. And perhaps most importantly, guilds preserved names. Thousands upon thousands of names of apprentices, journeymen, masters, and widows. Without guild records, most of these people would be invisible to history. Through dull ledgers and fines, their existence is remembered. Reflection. As you imagine a guild hall in its later years, picture not bustling markets or fierce regulation, but aging masters meeting by candlelight, reviewing accounts in the same old formulas, struggling to enforce rules that no longer fit the world outside. Picture journeymen drifting toward wage labor, merchants ignoring guild privileges, rulers asserting authority. And yet, even as their power waned, guilds left behind the memory of routine. Their records, contracts, fines, prayers, and ledgers still whisper of the rhythm they once imposed on cities. So one might ask, if guilds were so bound to routine and record-keeping, is it possible that their true legacy was not in controlling work, but in teaching societies to live by rules, to structure time, and to endure monotony as the basis of order?